Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Justice at a Crossroads in New York City. Thank you so much for joining us for this timely presentation of new research on safety and justice in New York City. Today's webinar will discuss two new studies released by the Data Collaborative Justice at John Jay College and the University of Maryland that examine decades of crime data, victimization rates, law enforcement trends, alternative to incarceration trends, and racial disparities, providing a nuanced view of public safety in New York City. Importantly, this research and data documents the dramatic public safety improvements that New York City was able to achieve between 1990 and 2019, with a nearly 80% reduction in violent crime. During that same time period that New Yorkers were experiencing increasing safety, the city's criminal justice system was shrinking, both in response to lower crime and because of intentional reforms to public safety laws, programs, policies, and budgets. NYPD reduced enforcement, particularly for lower level crimes, and prosecutors increased the rate at which they declined to prosecute lower level offenses. Judges' bail setting practices changed both before and after statewide bail reforms came into effect in 2020, which in turn impacted the number of people that were sitting in jail while awaiting trial. At the same time, New York City expanded its investments in diversion programs, reentry programs, victim services, and other community-based public safety programs, such as community violence interruption programs. The state raised the age of criminal responsibility, thereby shielding more young people in New York City from the adult criminal process. And these are just some of the changes that resulted in a smaller criminal justice system with many fewer New Yorkers held in our jails and prisons. And while New York has been quite successful in improving safety over the course of 35 years, recent years have brought challenges, including a pandemic spike in violent crime. In addition, many New Yorkers are rightfully uneasy about disorder in the streets and the subways, including with regards to homelessness and substance misuse. In addition, recent and rapid shifts in federal policies on everything from immigration enforcement to funding for community-based justice programs threaten the progress that New York City has made in delivering safety for more New Yorkers. So we now stand at a crossroads with regards to safety and justice. Can the city continue its long-term trend towards greater safety and a smaller criminal justice system? Or will we embrace a traditional tough-on-crime approach that focuses on arrest and incarceration as the primary mechanisms for delivering safety? Today's webinar, which is co-sponsored by John Jay College and the Columbia Justice Lab, will provide data and research to inform the path forward. We will also hear some reflections on this research from two of New York City's public safety leaders. We're grateful for their participation, Stanley Richards and Elizabeth Glazer, who will help us make sense of the trends reflected in the research and identify ways in which New York City can continue to make progress with regards to safety and justice. I'd like to remind our audience that today's webinar is the kickoff for a day-and-a-half convening that John Jay's Future Public Safety Initiative that we're hosting with the Columbia Justice Lab and our colleagues from the Data Collaborative for Justice. The in-person Crossroads convening will take place on May 13th and 14th, so next Tuesday and Wednesday, and it will provide an opportunity to engage with public safety experts from across the city, from government, nonprofit, press, academic, and advocacy communities. Please use the link in the chat to view the full program and to register. All are welcome. It is free and open to the public. And now, before we move on to the research presentations and discussion, I'd like to really thank the Division of Criminal Justice Services, particularly the Commissioner, Rosanna Rosado, and Executive Deputy Commissioner Joseph Popkin for their support, both for the research that you will hear about today, as well as the convening that we're hosting next week. They have been champions of this project and incredible partners to John Jay, and we will now hear briefly from Commissioner Rosado.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar, which sets the stage for John Jay College's Crossroads convening. I am Rosanna Rosado, Commissioner of the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services. We call it DCJS. I am pleased to share a few insights that align with the critical discussions you will be hearing today and continuing next week. For over 50 years, DCJS has been committed to enhancing public safety by providing resources and services that inform decision-making and improve the quality of the criminal justice system. Our mission is to work with all the stakeholders to bring the resources, expertise, and information needed for a more fair, equitable, and efficient justice system. This mission, however, has changed and grown in recent years and is now better summed up as building safer and stronger communities. As we log on today, New York City stands at a pivotal moment. At DCJS, we have witnessed both the challenges and the progress in our collective pursuit of safety and justice. New York is one of the safest large states in the country and has one of the lowest incarceration rates. But we know that not everyone is feeling that progress. Too many communities, especially communities of color, are burdened by unacceptable levels of violence. Over the past several years, under Governor Kathy Hochul's leadership, we have significantly increased our investment in evidence-driven programs to better address crime, its causes, and its consequences. I like to say that we doubled down on what we knew worked. We focused on initiatives that reduce gun violence through programs like GIVE, the Gun Involved Violence Elimination Initiative, and support for community-based violence interruption programs like SNUG. We have seen encouraging results, with reported shootings declining in recent years to record lows. We strengthen local law enforcement with resources, technology, and intelligence sharing capabilities through the Crime Analysis Centers, we call it the CAC network, and grants for equipment. We supported communities most impacted by violence through initiatives like Project Rise, which fosters partnerships between government and community organizations to address the complex needs of individuals and families. We invested in alternatives to incarceration and pretrial services on the front end of the system to better connect individuals with the resources they need and to close the system's revolving door. We addressed the changing needs of justice-involved individuals through reentry programs like the County Reentry Task Forces, the implementation of the Clean Slate Act, and the Governor's Jails to Jobs initiative. And we combated hate crimes and domestic violence through dedicated grant programs to protect our community groups and enhance support for law enforcement and prosecution efforts, respectively. Our approach emphasizes evidence-based strategies, data-driven decision-making, and strong partnerships with local stakeholders. As the Crossroads convening aims to highlight, it is crucial to balance enforcement with prevention and to enhance the role of communities in producing safety. We are all in this together. The research that will be presented in this webinar, examining long-term trends in crime, victimization, and the criminal justice system in New York City, is vital. It provides the foundation for the discussions at the convening about the future of safety and justice in our city. It also pushes back on myths and misperceptions that are abundant in what we read and hear every day. To create safety and justice strategies that truly work for all New Yorkers, it's essential to combine what the data and research tell us with the real experiences and voices of communities. On behalf of the entire DCJS team, I am proud to support these efforts and remain committed to working alongside our partners at all levels of government to ensure safer neighborhoods and a fair and equal justice system built on mutual trust and accountability. Thank you, and I look forward to the insightful presentation that will follow.
Thank you to Commissioner Rosado for framing today's conversation, for your support of this program, and thank you also for all that DCJS does to support community safety, both in New York City and across the state. I realized I failed to introduce myself at the top of the program. I'm Erica Bond. I'm the Vice President of Justice Initiatives at John Jay College. I also run our Future Public Safety Initiative, and I'm really pleased to be here with my colleagues from the Data Collaborative and the University of Maryland and others that are part of the John Jay family for this presentation. So now I'd like to welcome two researchers who will be presenting their findings from the Crossroads Research Project. First, we have Dr. Min Shea, who's a professor of criminology and criminal justice at the University of Maryland. And we also have Dr. Stephen Koppel, who's a senior research associate at the Data Collaborative for Justice. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Shea, who's going to be presenting some really interesting and first of their kind findings with respect to the National Crime Victims Survey and an analysis specifically of New York City data. So thank you, Dr. Shea. We're thrilled to have you.
Thank you, Erica. Give me a moment to set it up. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the webinar. I know how busy you are, so I really appreciate your time. And today we're here to present findings from two studies. These are based on the collaboration between researchers and John Jay and University of Maryland. Before we present the findings, it's important to state the goal of the research. Essentially, we suggest that policy discussions concerning how New York City should respond to crime and violence today should be based on objective data. And to do that, we use data from the 1990s to the early 2020s to analyze several trends of interest. I will be presenting data concerning crime victimization using the National Crime Victimization Survey, and then Steve will report the rest of the trends. So let's go to study one. This study, we use the NCVS data to study crimes in New York City. By the title, many will ask, why is the NCVS data important? Well, as we all know, when we study crime, the data we use really matters. Crime data from the police departments are important. However, a limitation of the data is that they only measure crimes known to the police. And therefore, victim surveys are important because they help measure crimes both reported and not reported to the police. And based on the research that has been conducted in the US for the last half a century, we know that more than 50% of crimes are not reported to the police nationwide. And therefore, for New York City, it's really important to look at victim survey data as well. More specifically, we use the NCVS data from the 1996 to 2022 to analyze the following trends. First is the crime victimization rate, and then the rate at which victims will call the police, and victims' confidence in the police, and finally, victims' use of services provided by agencies other than the police. I know that many of you here are familiar with NCVS data, therefore I won't provide a lot of information. We do have a report that's published that provides the information. Also, we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have after the presentation. Still, I would like to stress several important points about the data. First is NCVS data doesn't measure homicide because the data comes from interviews of the victims. And then violence includes in rape, sexual assault, robbery, aggravated assault, and simple assault. And property crimes measured in the NCVS includes burglary, motor vehicle theft, and other types of theft. And serious violence in this report refers to rape, sexual assault, robbery, and aggravated assaults using the definition used by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. So now let's go to the finding part of the presentation. And in order to present the results, I'll use graphs. In all of these graphs, The red lines refer to New York City. The blue lines refer to other large cities with population over 1 million. And then the US average is indicated by the gray line. So this makes it easy for you to see the comparison. When we look at victimization rates, it's easy to see from these graphs. From the beginning of the study period to the end of the study period, both violent crimes and property crimes have declined. And then when you compare New York City to other large cities, indicated by the difference between the red line and the blue lines, you can see that New York City has been relatively safe for its residents. Still, it's important when we look at these graphs, realize that the difference in victimization rates between New York City and other large cities has narrowed over time, as indicated by these gaps at the beginning of the study period. They're relatively large. And when we look at the end of the study period, the difference is relatively small. And this has a lot to do with the fact that both violent crime and property crimes in New York City has stayed either stable or has increased in most recent years. And then when we turn to the police notification in New York City, just like the rest of the country, more than 50% of the crimes are not reported to the police. And importantly, we noticed for both serious violence and for property crimes, there has been a decline in police notification. For example, in the beginning of the study period, the serious violence reporting rate was 57%. By the end of the study period, it's 42%. And for property crimes, in the beginning of the study period was 32%. And then it's reduced to 22% by the end of the study period. So these are very important for policymakers to realize the change in the reporting rates. And even possibly more importantly is when we looked at victims' confidence in the police as indicated by a question in the NCVS, which is when victims do not call the police, and then the survey asks them why they didn't call the police, and some victims will say police wouldn't help. So that's an indicator of victims' confidence in the police. As you can see, for both violent crimes and for property crimes, the percentages of victims saying so has increased over time. So for example, for violent crimes, starting at 8% on the beginning of the study period, and then was 16% near the end. And then for property crime was 13% and increased to about 18%. And finally, when we look at the victims' use of services, and interestingly, you can see, even though the beginning of the turn of the 20th century, there was a reduction in victims' use of services. And still after 2002, there has been a steady increase in the victims' use of services. So near the end of the study period, close to 30% of victims who experienced serious violence were using services. Even though the data would not allow us to answer what was the cause of this change, anecdotally, this may have to do something to do with the increase in the investment in victim services in New York City. To summarize, the major findings from the NCVS is that there are both good news and bad news. The good news, including the crimes declined, and New York City is still relatively safe compared to other large cities, and there was increase in victims' use of services after 2002. The bad news, or the news that requires us to think about future research, is the gap in victimization rates between New York City and other large cities that narrowed, and there was declining police notification rates and less confidence in the police. So now I will turn the presentation to Steve, and thank you.
Hey everyone, my name is Stephen Coppell. I'm a researcher with the Data Collaborative for Justice at John Jay College. And in this second Crossroads presentation, I'll be walking you through long-term trends in 5 areas, from crime to law enforcement to the courts to incarceration and racial disparities. Typically, we'll be looking all the way back to 1990 and up to at least 2023, though this may vary depending on data availability. We'll be covering a lot of ground, so just as a heads up, everything you see here is in our published report, along with data on a variety of other measures. So picking up from Min's presentation on victimization data, we'll now turn to the subset of data on crimes that get reported to the police, with data presented as annual totals, along with adjusted rates for population size. We'll start with index crime, aka Part 1 offenses, which are defined by the FBI and include serious violent offenses, murder, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault, as well as property offenses, burglary, larceny, and motor vehicle theft. Note that the blue bars here represent the annual totals, while the light blue line represents the adjusted rate. From 1990 to 2019, New York City saw a 79% drop in the population adjusted rate of index crime, down from 126 to 26 per 1,000 people. Put another way, this meant that for every 1,000 New Yorkers, there were 100 fewer index crimes reported in 2019 versus 1990. From 2019 to 2023, the index crime rate then rose from 26 to 37 per 1,000, amounting to a 42% rate increase. Looking at just serious violent crimes, from 1990 to 2019, the rate fell by 77%, from 31 per 1,000 to 7 per 1,000. And then following 2019, rose until 2022 and fell somewhat, landing at about 8 per 1,000 people in 2023. Switching to property crime, overall the rate fell by 81% from 1990 to 2019, a slightly larger decline than seen for violent crime, and then rose by 58% from 2019 to 2023, landing at about 29 per 1,000 people. Shooting incidents, which are not included among the index offenses, followed a similar pattern to violent crime, falling from above 5,000 in 1993 to under 800 in 2019, an 87% drop. And since two swung up and down, rising above 1,600 in 2021, and then falling back under 1,000 in 2023. So where do things stand today in New York? To answer this question, we looked at several different benchmarks. First was New York City today versus New York City in 2019 before the pandemic. So far in 2025, and this is data that's hot off the press from the latest CompStat report that runs through Sunday. The total number of major 7 felonies remains 32% above the 2019 pre-pandemic level, with the largest increases since 2019 seen for grand theft auto. It's up threefold, felony assaults up by about half, and petty larceny up 30%. Two bright spots here were shooting incidents, up only 1%, and murders, which were exactly the same as the same period in 2019. Second, we compared New York City's performance post-pandemic versus the 10 other largest US cities. Since 2019, New York City has seen the largest percent increase in serious violent offenses, up 35%, and the second largest percent increase in serious property offenses, up 22%. Last, we compared the 2025 population adjusted crime rates across the same large US cities. And the good news here is that New York City's rates remain comparatively low. Murder rate was the second lowest, burglary was the lowest, and robbery ranked 6th. Just an asterisk here. So with respect to the 2025 data on this slide, it's all preliminary and subject to change. In this next section, we'll look at trends in law enforcement, from pedestrian stops to the issuance of civil and criminal summonses to arrests. So from 2003 to 2011, the total number of pedestrian stops increased more than fourfold, reaching a peak of nearly 700,000 stops, Then following the ruling in the Floyd case, which found NYPD stop practices at the time unconstitutional, the number of stops dropped by 99%, down to under 9,000. And then between 2021 and 2024, stops rose to about 25,000, amounting to a nearly threefold increase over the last several years. The next two figures look at the issuance of two types of summonses: civil summonses, which typically result in a fine payable online, and a criminal summons, which can lead to more serious consequences like a higher fine, court appearance, possibility of a warrant. Just a quick background point: starting in 2017, under the CJRA, or the Criminal Justice Reform Act, several common low-level offenses were redirected to civil court. This first figure shows trends in civil summons issuance starting in 2018. It's the earliest available data. From 2018 to 2020, total civil summons issuance fell by 81%, from about 50,000 to 10,000. Then from 2021 to 2024, rose about eightfold to over 90,000. In 2024, notably, more than 50,000 civil summons were issued for open container violations of alcohol alone. This next figure looks at criminal summonses. From 2006 to 2021, criminal summonses fell by 91%, from about 500,000 to under 50,000, a 91% decrease. Since then, the total more than doubled, reaching about 95,000 in 2024. But just putting these last two slides together, since 2021, we've seen sizable increases in both civil and criminal summonses. Last, turning to arrest. Here we see trends from 1990 to 2023, broken out by severity. Notably, we saw different patterns across severity types. From 1990 to 2010, misdemeanor arrests more than doubled, while nonviolent felony and violent felony arrests declined. Then between 2019 and 2023, misdemeanor and nonviolent felony arrests returned to roughly their pre-pandemic levels, while violent felony arrests remained 29% higher. In this next section, we'll turn to the courts, particularly decisions by prosecutors and judges. Starting with prosecutors, this first figure looks at prosecutorial decisions on whether to file a charge following an arrest, i.e. a declined prosecution. From 1990 to 2017, the rate of declined prosecutions rose modestly for all severity types, ranging from about 3 to 5 percentage points. And then between 2017 and 2020, rates spiked for misdemeanors, up 11 percentage points, while increasing somewhat for nonviolent felonies, up 7 percentage points, and violent felonies up only 2 percentage points. Since 2020, the rate of declined prosecutions has continued to increase for misdemeanors, up another percentage point to about 1 in 5, but has fallen slightly for nonviolent and violent felonies. Here we're looking at judges' pretrial release decisions in cases continued past arraignment. From 1998 to 2018, through gradual changes in judge practices, you call it a judge-led reform, we saw the rate of bail or remand cut in half, down from 48% to 24%. And then following statutory reform in 2020, which initially mandated the release of nearly all people charged with misdemeanor and nonviolent felony offenses, the rate fell further, down below 20%. You'll also see on the top right a sharp increase in supervised release, represented in the orange bars, after relaxing the eligibility requirements around the time of reform. By 2020, about 1 out of 5 people was assigned to supervised release. Just to quickly double click on arraignment decisions, this figure breaks down release decisions by severity. From 1987 to 2019, you'll see that the largest decreases in the rate of bail or remand, it's the light blue bars, occurred for misdemeanors, down 18 percentage points, and nonviolent felonies down 20 percentage points, while during the same time, the rate increased for violent felony offenses, or up 5 percentage points. But since reform in 2020, the rate of bail or remand has fallen across all severities, and for nonviolent felonies in particular, supervised release is now assigned in more than 1 in 3 cases. Here we see trends in the percentage of prosecuted cases that result in conviction, broken out by severity. Since 1990, criminal conviction rates have declined substantially across all offense categories, with the steepest drop seen for misdemeanors, down 28 percentage points, and nonviolent felonies down 35 percentage points, with a large portion of this change occurring since 2019. That's circled there in red. To track trends in alternatives to incarceration, or ATIs, we pulled together data on drug, mental health, veterans, and community courts, data from some of the city's other large ATIs. The data here show that the use of alternatives rose substantially during the 2000s, declined over the next decade, and then climbed to a new high of over 19,000 in 2023. Note that this is consistent with the finding presented earlier by Min of an uptick in the use of victim services throughout New York City. This next section tracks trends in incarceration and community corrections. This first figure shows the proportion of carceral sentences in cases that ended in conviction, with jail represented in dark blue and prison in light blue. For misdemeanors, it's at top left, the share of carceral sentences declined from 22% in 1990 to 9% in 2019, so more than half. Then fell further to 7% in 2023. For nonviolent felonies, it's the top right, total carceral sentences fell from 55% in 1990 to 24% in 2019, so again by more than half, and then fell further to 20% in 2023. Notably, violent felonies followed a different trend, falling from 56% in 1990 to 41% in 2019. But then in the most recent period, rose up to 47%, an increase that was driven exclusively by prison sentences. The average daily jail population on the left peaked above 20,000 in 1991, and then fell by 81% to a low of around 4,000 in 2020, and then reversed upward above 6,000 in 2024. The latest estimate has it above roughly 6,800. The average daily prison population on the right peaked above 47,000 in 1996, and then fell by 76% to a low of about 11,000 in 2022, before rising above 12,000 in 2024. According to the latest figures, both the jail and prison population remain below their pre-pandemic levels. Last among people eligible for parole, the state's parole board substantially increased its approval rate. For those convicted of a nonviolent felony, their approval rate rose by 18 percentage points since 2008. And for people convicted of violent felonies, approvals were lower overall, but more than tripled, up from 8% in 2008 to 27% in 2023. Finally, we examined racial and ethnic disparities among the previously shown measures. We looked at two main measures. First, we looked at change over time in the absolute numbers by simply comparing the percentage change for each group from the peak volume in the data to 2019, and then from 2019 to 2023. Second, we looked at relative trends. Specifically, we calculated the per capita rate for each group, and then compared the Black and Hispanic rates to the white rate. These are typically called racial disparity rate ratios. You'll see here the different racial and ethnic groups across the top. The first highlighted column shows overall change from the peak year to 2019, and the second from 2019 to 2023. With light blue indicating a decrease and dark blue an increase. Two quick observations. First, from each group's peak year to 2019, we saw substantial declines across all metrics. So it's all light blue up and down. And then second, from 2019 to 2023, we saw increases in dark blue in some metrics, particularly among Black and Hispanic individuals, and most notably in law enforcement practices, stops, summons, and arrests. So how did this translate in relative terms? From each metric's peak to 2019, the disparities between Black and white individuals and between Hispanic and white individuals narrowed, as shown here in the first column. It's all light blue again. And then between 2019 and 2023, most of these gaps either narrowed slightly or widened slightly, with some notable exceptions. So specifically, since 2019, we've seen large increases in the Black-white ratio for pedestrian stops, prison sentences, and the prison population. Just to quantify the change, as an example, this meant that for every one pedestrian stop of a white person in 2019, there were about 9 stops of Black individuals. By 2023, this number grew by 5.6 to a rate ratio of nearly 15 to 1. So at the risk of oversimplifying a bit, I'll finish with a few macro points. First, from 1990 to 2019, the trend lines all moved together. Major index crimes fell by 76%. Law enforcement activity declined across the board. The average daily jail and prison populations decreased by more than 60%. And second, from 2019 to 2023, some all of these trends began to reverse, particularly measures of crime and law enforcement. Third, racial disparities narrowed from 1990 to 2019, but then widened across several measures over the next 4 years, particularly with respect to stops and prison. And then finally, current indicators of crime in New York City are mixed. So on the one hand, as we've seen, compared to historical highs in the 1990s, crime remains low. Relative to other big cities, New York City still enjoys low rates, and shootings and murders have now receded back to their pre-pandemic levels. On the other, the public safety gap between New York City and other big cities has narrowed. Notably, this was seen in both the victimization data presented earlier by Min and the more recent reported crime data. And finally, compared to 2019, major felonies remain up by 32%. With that, I'll pass it back to Erica.
Great. Thank you, Min and Steve, both for those really clear and comprehensive presentations, but also for all the work that went into the underlying research. And I really encourage all of our viewers to use the link in the chat and take a closer look at some of the underlying research that supported these presentations. I also want to take a second and acknowledge the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation for their support of this research. We are really grateful for that. As you can see, it's a lot of work to put all of this together, and without their support, it would not have been possible. So thank you again to the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. So now I'd really like to turn it over to two key voices in the New York City public safety and justice landscape to help us make sense of all of this data and information over the course of roughly 35 years. So I'd like to welcome Liz Glazer, who's the founder of Vital City, and Stanley Richards, the president and CEO of the Fortune Society. I won't go into their many accomplishments, but suffice it to say, there are links in the chat where you can find their full bios. And really just want to jump right into the conversation here. So Liz, I will start with you. Again, thank you for joining us. So we just looked at decades of research that was just presented, and during at least some of that period, you worked in various parts of government focused on public safety. So you were a prosecutor, you were the deputy secretary for public safety to the governor, you were the director of the mayor's office of criminal justice, I think for nearly 8 years. And so you've really closely both observed these crime trends, and you also helped to design some of the major policies and programs that influenced, we think, these trends. And so I'd love to just give you, I know it's a big question, but what do you think explains some of the success that we've seen in terms of the very dramatic reductions that are documented here with respect to violent crime? And then we can talk about the complicating factors in more recent years. But in terms of the macro picture here, what do you think has contributed to that decline?
Sure. So thank you so much, Erica, and really an honor to be with Stanley again and to have heard those presentations from Min and Steve. So just, kind of a little bit of a spoiler alert. We're obviously focusing very much on, criminal processes of all kinds. But I think the most important thing, especially as we look forward, is that safety actually isn't only about the police. And we've gotten used to kind of cabining ourselves in kind of the Rorschach test of you say crime, I say police, when in fact, what controls behavior and what makes us safe is the way in which we connect to one another, and there are a lot of things that affect that. So I think in some ways the answer to your question, there's like a pre and post pandemic answer. So, as you saw from all of Steve's incredible charts, since the 90s, New York City, first nationally, crime is kind of abating, but New York City has always kind of stood out. And since the 90s, we've had like more durable and sustained declines than anybody else. This is pre-pandemic. And a big part of that was policing, with police focusing on the very, very small number of people who actually drive the violence. And obviously, this wasn't at all perfect. It was often a blunt instrument with takedowns of hundreds of people, ranging from crimes that were very serious to really not so much. We all know the story of the almost 700,000 stops that I think, we still suffer from a little bit of phantom limb syndrome about. But it was important, and it's been significant. And I was just looking at the clearance rates, the solve rates for murders, 90%. That really contrasts with a place like Chicago, whose murders look the way we did in the 1990s, and who maybe has a solve rate of like 5%. And there was then, though, and what you were referring to, this really pretty extraordinary period, kind of 2017, 2019, when crime was really at the lowest it had been in the city's history. And at the same time, the jail population dropped by 40%. And there were a lot of things going on. Behavior obviously changed. The police began being much more precise about who they were arresting, who they were summoning, kind of taking their foot off the gas. There was a huge amount of money being put into diversion programs, something that judges wanted as well. They wanted an option between jail and nothing. And jail admissions dropped by something almost 50%. With an understanding that oftentimes jail begets jail. More judges putting people into sentences in the community as opposed to in jail. And there was some other stuff going on. As I said, the criminal justice system isn't the only way to control risk and manage behavior. There are a gazillion other ways beyond handcuffs of doing that. The physical environment is an important thing. Turning on the lights, random controlled trials in New York City housing developments show crime drops by 36% when you turn on the lights, not in 100 years, right then. And so there was also a ton going on in that pre-pandemic period that really had to do with strengthening neighborhoods and civilian looks at how to control crime. And then when the pandemic came, the lid just came off and shootings doubled in that first year. They stayed there and then gradually have come down, as Steve has said, are now almost flat to where they were beforehand. But other crimes are still highly elevated. And I think that sort of goes to the importance of what happens when the social fabric just gets rent, work, play, school, all dissolves. And so now, kind of as we move forward, particularly when we're kind of peering over the edge of a revenue cliff, right? We, hysterically optimistic state budget, but really we don't know what's going to happen. We've seen the Cure Violence money cut. We've seen all kinds of other money cut for cities that is going to be important. And so I think now is particularly the time to take seriously all the civilian ways to keep us safe, because these are twofers. They improve city life and they reduce crime. And not surprisingly, those two things are related, whether it's lighting, summer youth employment, cognitive behavioral therapy, a whole range of things. Tour. Hopefully it answered your question.
Thank you, Liz. And I want to come back to sort of this post-pandemic period and some of the more complicated data that we have around crime, because I think it is painting a little bit too broad of a picture to just say, oh, crime has consistently declined and we're much safer. That is not reassuring, I think, to a lot of folks who really do feel like the city is not as safe as it once was. So I want to talk about that a little bit more. But before we do that, I wanted to bring Stanley into the conversation and get his perspective. So Stanley, you're the leader of a nonprofit that provides reentry supports broadly to people who are returning home from prison. And you've been doing this during a period of real declining crime. And so would love to get your thoughts and perspectives on how some of these trends that were documented through this research with respect to crime, enforcement, alternatives to incarceration, and also the racial disparities that are documented here. How has that played out with regards to the work that you do each and every day in communities?
Thank you for that, Erica. And it's an honor to be here with all of you to have this conversation. But in New York City, we are at a crossroads where we need to be having this conversation and charting a path forward. Let me start by saying something that Liz talked about, is that for far too long, we've had this notion that public safety only equals enforcement and incarceration. And what this data shows is that we could have safe communities and a smaller footprint on criminal justice. When I look at Fortune's work, I've been affiliated with Fortune since 1991. And the charts that Stephen shows with the investments in ATI, I can look at our budget and the investments that our partners have made in reentry and diversion. And you would see, as crime has come down, investments in ATI and other resources has gone up. The challenge is that we need to start making those investments sustainable. And we've seen on this chart where investments in ATI went up and then it comes down and then it goes up. And we need to be thinking about public safety, that it's not a silver bullet that's going to resolve that. It's not one response. We need to have a range of responses that address the root causes of crime, which is poverty, mental illness, substance use, community isolation, and underinvestments in some of the most vulnerable communities in New York City. And so when you see this data and you see the racial makeup of it, we need to be asking ourselves, why? When we look at the New York City population, the percentage of Black and brown people compared to the general population is very small. But when you look at the number of Black and brown people impacted by the criminal justice system, it's very high. And we need to talk about that reality and we need to confront it. And so that one of the things that Fortune has been doing is bringing those kind of issues to light, both from a service perspective and an advocate.
Thank you, Stanley, for the insights, but also for all of the work that you're doing. And I actually wanted to turn back to Liz here, because Liz, Vital City has put out a report that analyzes some of the more recent crime data, and I think speaks to some of what Stanley is talking about with regards to the concentration of crime and victimization in certain communities, in Black and brown communities, and in certain neighborhoods within New York. And while, again, we can sort of say citywide, we've seen a great deal of success overall with regards to safety. When you dig into some of this data, you do see these very persistent and concerning trends with regards to certain neighborhoods and certain communities. I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit more about that.
Sure. It's exactly right. I think that the citywide data really masks some very profound problems. You know, we're a highly segregated city, and in areas that are home to Black and brown residents, violence has concentrated for decades. So if you were to look at a chart of what shootings looked like in neighborhoods, the top 10 neighborhoods that suffered shootings in 1993, and now a high percentage, something like 7 out of 10 of them will be the same. it will be Brownsville and East New York and a number of other places. And even though the number of shootings is dramatically reduced, like just think of murders. Murders in the 1990s, there were 2,200. There are 400 today. So even though the numbers are reduced, they're still concentrated in just a few neighborhoods. And so if you're the person living in that neighborhood, it doesn't matter that it's, so much less than it was 30 years ago. Uh, it's still a huge amount compared to everything else. Uh, and I don't know if this is when we're going to the perception piece, but if you wanted me
Feel
to,
free, please.
um, so it obviously violent crime is so incredibly because it's so serious. And, in the case of gun violence, it has, effects obviously on the shooter and on the victims and on the families, and it ripples across neighborhoods and down generations. Study after study shows that, it's hard to do your homework when you're surrounded by that kind of violence and it leads to, falling behind academically and things like that. Um, so it's very important. It's very concentrated, but so that even though there's sort of some good news in things coming down, there's still this feeling among New Yorkers of kind of just being on edge and sort of jittery, whether it's in, the subways or walking down the streets. And so why could that be given, all the numbers that Steve was showing us about how much lower crime is? And I think one reason is that when we talk about crime, usually we talk about major crime, murder, robbery, rape. And that's the way we measure things. But there are a lot of crimes going on every day, the body slam, the push, the shove, the slash, the punch, that are the things that are kind of like the drumbeat potentially of city life. And those are not concentrated by neighborhood. Those are all over. And so there are 400, murders a year. I think what we're seeing is that we're told about the big numbers, but it's the little numbers that people are feeling every day. And those have been spiking. So, more assaults now than there have been, in a decade. And like that.
Thanks.
And I would
Go ahead.
Erica, I think, and my apologies for my glasses turning, the sun is coming out and shining in the room, and my glasses are transitioning. But there's another piece to that. If you look at the report that was just put in the chat, Vital Cities, on Crime in 2024, and you look at that deep dive in where in those communities violent crime is happening, you can put economic and economic map for those communities and see that those are also the communities with the highest level of poverty, highest levels of substance use and mental illness, like all of the things that have communities feel like they are not valued and they are not part of the larger city. And so in addition to what Liz just said about, concentrated crime, when people feel like they are dealing with more than just crime and like they are in it alone, that translates into distrust for the people who are supposed to protect them, the police. It translates into hopelessness and survival mode. And when people go into survival mode, they go into the behaviors that they think will get them to the next day. And as a city, And this is where social service organizations and reentry organizations come in. As a city, at the same time we're investing in policing strategies, we ought to be investing in diversion and reentry services, because those services are about providing people with an economic opportunity to get a job and care for themselves and care for their family, get access to and enroll in drug treatment. I mean, I looked at our data at Fortune. In 2011, we served 6,000 people. In FY25, we have already served over 16,000 people, on track to serve 17,000 people. In part because we've had partners investing in our work and we've been able to respond to the need. But it's a investment today and a cut tomorrow. And we need to have sustained investments in reentry services to help people reintegrate back into their community, give them an economic opportunity to care for themselves and their family, and instill some sense of hope that tomorrow can be better than yesterday.
Thank you. We could talk about this all day. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. Stanley, you mentioned briefly some of the concerns about overemphasizing policing in our responses to crime. And I want to just, I don't think we have enough time to really talk about it, but there will be much more discussion about this at the convening itself. But I think it's worth flagging again some of that crime victimization survey data that is showing declining rates of trust with regards to reporting to NYPD and victims reporting essentially that they're not reporting because they do not feel they're going to get a response. And I think that speaks to some of the concerns that you're raising about communities really feeling disconnected and not feeling cared for. And certainly that's playing out in some of the data around policing. But I imagine we could see something similar if we surveyed about other government entities as well. And so I think what you're really speaking to is a need to have community-based organizations that have more trust with their communities and can fill that gap when there isn't real trust, right, with the police or with other representations of government. So thank you for raising that. So we are running out of time here, and I do want to leave. But actually, maybe we can spend just a moment on this. I would like to get your reflections on these indicators of declining trust in NYPD in recent years, and just some thoughts on how we should be thinking about that, and how NYPD and the rest of government really should be responding to some of the data that Min presented on victimization and reporting. Liz, I'll let you go first, and then I'll kick it back to Stanley. Liz, you're on mute. No worries.
My gosh, thank you. I think it's a problem with police departments. The problem of declining trust in our institutions is obviously much, much broader and much deeper. The courts, politicians, everything. And so I think that there's a general kind of disengagement and distrust and a kind of snowballing of who you're going to believe and about what. I think that I think police try to encourage trust, which obviously is so important, as Min was showing, in order to get people to actually report crimes, so that they can actually work on them. And I think that for my money, the way that police best increase trust is by doing their jobs to the best of their ability, by solving crimes. And that sounds kind of silly, but you see so much police effort in, setting up basketball games, starting employment programs, running. Police's job is about solving crimes. And that, I think that you trust people when they do their job and they do it well. And it would encourage people to report more crimes and to work to solve them.
So to first principles with regards to
Stanley. And I would add with a friendly amendment to what Liz just said. I think having those relationships where they are developing partnerships with communities through those activities that Liz just stated is important. Because I think right now, many communities, particularly where communities have crime concentrated, feel like the police departments are not in partnership, but in invasion. And so it's almost like there's a sense of they're coming in to save the day. And communities, particularly Black and Brown communities, don't need anybody to come in and save the day. They need our government partners to be in partnership with them to help solve those things. So I think that kind of partnership is important. The second piece to law enforcement doing their job, it's not just the police. When you look at the length of stay on Rikers, how long it takes to get cases adjudicated, there is a sense that the system doesn't work. So for the victims who want to get justice that have to wait multiple years for the case to get adjudicated and to get justice, lose hope that the system really works. And so we need to look at the entire system, not just the policing. We need to look at the prosecution. We need to look at the detention piece, the adjudication piece, because all of those pieces paint a picture about when I pick up the phone to call the police, whether or not I'm going to get true justice or get a response, or I'm going to get someone who thinks their job is to save me. And then the case goes off and we never hear anything again. So we need to look at the entire system to increase confidence that when someone calls the police, that a response is going to happen and justice is going to happen as the victim sees justice.
Thank you, Stanley, for raising that some of this victimization data may reflect concerns about policing, but also what comes after that and whether the whole system response is going to be appropriate to what a victim needs and is looking for. And I think some of the data around case processing times post-pandemic demonstrates that we really have a significant backlog in case processing, to your point. The courts recently announced an initiative to try to address some of that backlog and really speed up cases. And I think that is going to be a significant initiative to try to address some of the concerns that victims rightfully have about the system. So one final question, which is a big one for both of you. We are in the midst of primary season. We'll be selecting a new mayor in the upcoming months in New York City. And I would love to hear your thoughts on what you believe this next mayor needs to focus on in order to address the concerns about public safety in many of our communities. And we've heard through some of the polling that public safety is one of the leading considerations for voters in New York City. So would love to hear your parting thoughts on the kinds of policies and programs the next mayor really should be implementing in order to address the concerns that we talked about today. Liz, I'll let you go first, and then Stanley, you can finish us off. Liz, you're on mute again.
Just never learn. I think the most crucial thing is to understand that public safety is not just about the police department. And I think Stanley has very eloquently laid out all the different ways in which that's not the case. And they play such an important role, but they need to be at the table, not necessarily leading the table. For example, when we address, challenges of people who are unhoused, serious mental illness, who play into the public safety perception and reality issue. I think that there is, as I said, a big, broad lane that has not yet been occupied to reduce crime through all kinds of things that have nothing to do with the criminal justice system, like street lighting, like summer youth employment. But that needs to be part of a coordinated and consistent and relentless program. And in the same way that the police department has CompStat to keep them on track with their goals in order to reach them, there needs to be a broader civilian-led effort, of which the police are part, in order to address these incredibly complicated problems.
Thank you, Liz. Stanley.
We need to have sustained investments in multiple strategies. What we see right now is at Fortune, 25% of the people who walk through our doors are unstably housed. we need to have an investment in reentry housing and housing for unstably housed people. Over 50% of the people on Rikers right now have a mental health diagnosis. We need to make sure that we have resources for those folks so that when they come home, they don't end up on our subways and end up in the shadows of our streets. We need to address the issue of substance use so that people who are addicted to heroin and fentanyl and other drugs can get access, immediate access to treatment, be it residential, outpatient. So we need to make sustained investments. And so the next mayor needs to understand that public safety is not a one response issue. It is an issue that requires multiple responses with multiple sustained investments. And I'll end with this. We have invested for so long in punishment. We invest in police and we invest in incarceration to where one person costs over $400,000 incarcerated on Rikers Island. And we have invested in reentry, but the nickel on what it would really take to have a sustained effort. And so this next administration needs to make the investments necessary to bring about the sustained change that we've experienced over the years.
Thank you, Stanley. And I should add, I think these recommendations are applicable right now. We can start this work today. And I think the city has really, there has been a continued commitment across administrations for investments in the community. We've seen that with the crisis management system and other aspects of was what I think you'd term the sort of the civilian infrastructure. And I think these recommendations, again, can start today as part of this administration, and whomever the next mayor is can kind of continue that work. So it is urgent work, and it should be sustained. So thank you both for your insights and your contributions, most importantly, to making this a safer city. I do want to leave just a minute or two for questions. I'm sorry to folks in the audience. We had such a rich dialogue here. I didn't want to cut it off. So we have time for a couple of questions from the audience, and then I would encourage folks, if we're not able to get to your question, please reach out. Sarah will drop a link in the chat to the Data Collaborative, and you can reach out with questions about the research there. But in the few minutes that we have left, I do want to get to a couple of questions here. Let's see. There was a question about turning on the lights in public housing, Liz. I think folks wanted to better understand kind of what you meant by that. And I'll just say I was in Brownsville with the Center for Justice Innovation a few days ago, and we were in conversation with some public housing residents there who were talking about the partnership that they had with the Center for Justice Innovation, where they had identified places where darkness was contributing to a feeling of lack of safety, and also where there were kind of crime hotspots. And I presume that's what you're talking about, but I'm going to let you respond to that question about turning on the light.
I literally mean lights, like street lighting. It seems so obvious, but it's not at all. And so this, study, like at the highest level of research studies that happened in New York City housing, showed this 36% drop in felony crime at night when streetlights were put in dark places. And so just think about that. It's not about police. It's not about any individual person. It has a neighborhood-wide effect. And it's something that the city does anyway. So maybe it's as simple as not even spending more money, just adding in the public safety factor when the city decides where it's going to put those lights.
Thanks. And that's part of a whole body of research, right, that looks at what the impacts of environmental design can be on public safety. So there's some great studies that look at the way in which vacant lot clearance, for example, can also contribute to public safety in ways that folks might not be intuitive. So thank you for that. I do want to get to a question or two about the research itself, because there were some questions here for Min and Steve. One question that folks raised was, did the researchers look at data related to sexual orientation, gender identity, and/or gender expression, especially regarding people who said they didn't report because they didn't trust the police? I guess I'd broaden that out just to ask you, Min, what level of detail is available about respondents to the survey and how the demographics break out when it comes to this question around reporting and the rationale for not reporting?
Yeah, thank you for this question. One advantage of NCVS data is since 2016, the data does provide information about people's sex identity. And so those information is available in the NCVS. We didn't analyze the data for New York City for this research because of the sample size concerns. So in New York City, each year, the number of interviews is on average 7,000 interviews conducted each year. And so the number of people who identified would be very small. And for that reason, it's not studied, but there has been multiple studies published, including one in the American Journal of Public Health, talking about how to use NCVS data to analyze victimizations for those minority groups. And it's really a good study. I highly recommend them. For New York City, we simply do not have enough observations for the study.
Thank you, Min, for answering that question. I have one last question here that I will direct to Stanley. And the question is about the criminalization of mental illness. So someone states the fear of calling 911 because a police response can be potentially dangerous. The lack of community-based mental health services, including crisis response services, is serious, especially in Black and Brown communities. How do we move mental health needs to a public health response instead of a criminal response?
Absolutely. I was born and raised in Soundview, and I remember that some of my neighbors had mental illness, and we had a mental health clinic in our community. And throughout the decades, those mental health communities, centers were removed. And for whatever reason, went to sort of a central, bigger mental health where you had to go out of your community to go to receive mental health services. And so there is a way in which we could think about this. It's like, what does it take if we are seeing mental illness in particular communities? What does it take for us to invest? Again, it really comes down to how much of the resources we want to invest to try to prevent both the pathway to incarceration and pathway to stabilization through either mental health treatment, substance use treatment, or diversion. And so, yes, that does play a part, I think, in whether or not communities have confidence in the police. But it's also a function of the system disinvesting in communities around mental illness.
Thank you, Stanley, for addressing that question. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so I really want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank Min and Stephen again for those excellent presentations. Thank you to Liz and to Stanley again for all of your insights. I really encourage everyone to read the research reports because they really do paint a comprehensive picture of safety and justice in New York over roughly 3+ decades. I also want to remind our participants to please register for the upcoming Crossroads convening on May 13th and 14th. There will be opportunities to talk about more of these research findings with a broader set of folks over the course of a day and a half. We invite you to learn about the event, and you can, again, look to the chat for a link to register. And please reach out to us if you have any questions about either the convening or today's presentation. Thanks to everyone who attended today. I think we had several hundred people join us for this conversation, which is a testament to New Yorkers' interest in this topic. And we hope to see you next week in person at John Jay for the Crossroads convening. So thank you all and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.